I firmly believe that the legalization of abortion in the United States was perhaps the most profound legal decision by the Supreme Court that led this nation closer to its destruction. The barbarism of taking the life of a living human being and dress that up as someone's right should send chills down anyone's spine. If the argument in favor of abortion had any merits, it might have been more palatable, but it is riddled with blatant falsehoods and deception. We will deal with those falsehoods upon which the doctrine of the cult of abortion is founded. I would like to classify the justification for abortion into four main parts. The fetus is unviable outside the womb, number one. A woman has the right to choose, number two. Abortion in the case of rape or incest, or when the health of the mother is in danger. And finally, number four, an embryo is just a blob of tissue. In this program, I'll deal with the deception that the fetus is not viable outside the womb. As it is, when evil, which is what abortion is, when evil is left unchallenged, it metastasizes and grows into surrounding culture practices, invades them, and forces the people to adapt and practice that evil. It's just like cancer. What was used to justify third trimester abortions has metastasized into partial birth abortion, meaning a living baby already partly out of the birth canal may legally be slaughtered. The motivation for waiting till just before birth, before pulling the baby apart limb by limb, is that the body parts are worth more on the market the later the abortion is performed. The Democrats are the principal proponents and practitioners of this cancer, which has its roots in ancient beliefs that Democrats brought with them to Jamestown in 1607. Now, there were no Democrats back in 1607, but the ancestry of their evil beliefs stretch back to biblical times, as I shall show in an upcoming program. Anyway, let's deal with point number one, the fallacy that the fetus is non-viable outside the womb. Listen to the testimony of this evil practice and pay particular attention to the words pre-viable and viable and the context in which they were used. It is the belief of all of the abortion cult's followers who have a safe haven within the Democrat Party. Play the clip.
Ms. Smith, in the precursor to the Gonzalez case, the case of Stenberg versus Carhart, Justice Kennedy dissented from the decision to strike down the partial birth abortion ban, which was later upheld in the Gonzalez case in a different ban.
A different version, yes.
That's right. He described at length the testimony provided by abortionist Leroy Carhart about the alternate D&E method or dismemberment procedure. The fetus can be alive at the beginning of the dismemberment process and can survive for a time while its limbs are being torn off. Dr. Carhart agreed that when you pull out a piece of the fetus, let's say an arm or a leg, and remove that, at the time just prior to removal of the portion of the fetus is alive. Dr. Carhart also has observed fetal heartbeat via ultrasound with extensive parts of the fetus removed, and testified that mere dismemberment of a limb does not always cause death because he knows a physician who removed the arm of a fetus only to have the fetus go on to be born as a living child with one arm. At the conclusion of a D&E abortion, no intact fetus remains. In Dr. Carhart's words, the abortionist is left with a tray full of pieces. Justice Kennedy said, the fetus, in many cases, dies just as a human adult or child would. It bleeds to death as it is torn from limb. Ms. Smith, do you believe this practice represents a humane way to die?
Let me separate, which I think something that's getting confused here in this hearing again and again, which is procedures performed on pre-viable fetuses and procedures that are performed on viable fetuses. Both of the women here on this panel are here today because they were viable at the time the procedures were performed. What you're talking about is pre-viability procedures performed on a fetus that cannot survive outside.
Maybe,
its
maybe
mother.
not. Justice Kennedy was talking about a child that was born alive with only one arm because the other had been pulled off already in the abortion procedure. My
That's right,
question to you is, are you going to answer it? Is this a humane way to die?
I believe for a fetus, pre-viable fetus, yes, a D&E procedure is a very humane procedure, and it protects the woman and her health and safety more than any other procedure. And in fact, it was
Ms.
substituted
Smith,
for the
I'm going to
saline
reclaim my time and just
procedure.
say that I have to say that your view of humanity and mine are different.
Were you also appalled by the complete comfort with which this monster of a woman delivered her testimony? She appears to be less troubled by this evil practice and killing of children than she would be adjusting her makeup. There is no difference between her demeanor and that of Joseph Mengele. Like every other person who loves life in all of nature, I am deeply mourning the more than 50 million children who were massacred by Democrats at the altar of liberalism since Roe v. Wade became the law of the land. Let's expose the utter depravity of their argument about a fetus's viability outside the womb. The most profound physiological event in any person occurs at conception. The 8 weeks and 22 weeks arguments have no basis in truth because there is nothing that happens to the embryo that rivals that of conception, where the useless tissue of an egg and a sperm cell change into a person. An embryo is either a person at conception or it is never a person. Until death at old age, all the DNA, all the characteristics, attributes, and personality of the person have been locked into the embryo at conception. All that the embryo experiences, first as a fetus, then an infant, then a toddler, then an adolescent, then an adult, and finally at old age, are nothing other than a migration from and adaptation to a new environment, so that it is able to grow and survive. Any premature removal from one environment and forced into another will usually be fatal to the person. Birth into infancy is nothing other than a change of environment from the womb to the outside world. There is no magic or change taking place that alters anything about the child's personhood at all. It is merely the environment that changes, as it does throughout its life till death occurs. An infant is just as subject to death through the elements of a new environment as it would be if the fertilized egg fails to travel down the fallopian tube to the uterus. It has to make the journey fully and safely for the person to remain alive. The challenges of a future environment can never justify killing the person in a prior environment. That remains so throughout the person's life. Forcing an infant to survive in the environment of a teenager will cause its demise. The same goes for a toddler. The same is true if an old person is forced to live in the environment of a young adult in which it used to thrive. If we travel to another part of the country where the weather might be different to our regular environment, what do? We pack accordingly to protect us against that environment. And if we don't, it could be fatal. Take an adult who is comfortable operating in a city environment with all its trappings, fast food, public transportation, running hot and cold water, refrigeration, and so on. Now take that silly city dweller without warning or preparation and forcibly remove him without any clothes, food, or protection and dump him in the Mojave or the Sahara Desert. Alone, with no skills how to survive in the desert, how long before he would succumb to the elements and be transformed into a blob of rotting tissue? And what about the anguish, the suffering, the pain, and unimaginable turmoil before death sets in mercifully? It is not that it is impossible to live in the desert. There are people living and thriving in the desert. But our newcomer has never ever been in a desert, just as a baby cannot survive outside the womb because it is a hostile environment, not because its life is somehow deficient or worthy of ending. It's not a fair analogy, one may argue. Perhaps, but why then subject to the fetus to those brutal circumstances? Killing a baby in the womb because it is incapable of surviving outside the womb is tantamount to claiming it would be justified killing a toddler because it won't be able to survive as an adult. Same thing, just different environments. Now, to bamboozle us into accepting this utter wickedness and madness, they convinced us that a fetus is not a person, but somehow, mysteriously, only changes into a person at birth without any evidence of any event that would implant the attributes of a person into a non-entity with no rights, occurring while moving from one environment to another. That's insane. Babies migrate from one environment to another all throughout its existence. He becomes a toddler, going to school, to high school, to college, drive his first car, go on his first date, get married, have children, and deal with life in its new and ever-changing environment. But it is moral and ethical to do so to a fetus. How do we stop this madness? Congress is incapable, as it has been the past 43 years. The Supreme Court is the cause of this debacle, so we should not look to that institution to rectify the evil that has been perpetrated upon us. They are the practitioners of it. It is up to us, the sovereign of this nation, to fix this. It is our children who are daily being sacrificed to the god of liberalism. And we stand around as if we're helpless, as if we have no recourse. We are to recall every elected official who votes for the killing of our children. We ought to impeach every judge who upholds this evil practice. We are ultimately responsible for the good and evil that befall us. To be fair, we must also ask this question. Are there any circumstances where abortion is justified, such as the health of the mother or in a case of rape or incest? We'll talk about that in the next program on abortion. Please join us.